Hello, and welcome to a little tidbit by me, your former professor. I thought it'd be prudent today to talk a little bit about what happened in the last 2 days, and also this is a test to see how actually having video and what my face would look like, and that would actually work out in a lecture. So this is a bit of a proof of concept for me. But nevertheless, so this is some pretty extraordinary things happened in the last 2 days, and yesterday and today. This is the 6th of January, and thought it'd be prudent to maybe take a minute and just talk about them. At least I've had the day to think about this for a little bit and process this to some degree. And from where I sit, that's all the time for me to think about this. Usually, when something like this happens with George Floyd, I really think for a couple of days about this and kind of get my thoughts in order and process this intellectually. And I've had about half a day to do this, which is a little more aggressive in terms of the scheduling that I like. But nevertheless, we'll see what this looks like. I'll do the best analysis I can. Okay, so my first thought when I look at we'll start. There's two things that happened in the last 2 days. We have the Georgia elections, and then we have the protest or riot or whatever you want to call it in Washington D.C. about in terms of the election certification by Congress. Now, let's talk about the former first. Um, the protest, right, or the riot, or the violence, or the mob rule, or the insurrection, whatever you want to call it, um, that's democracy. My initial response is we have this idealized version of democracy where people are just talking. And I think in the course I've probably talked about this where democracy is really, really messy and really can become contentious and can become violent. We are a Republican democracy, and that is an important point to make. Nevertheless, this you know many other democracies around the world, republics around the world, violence happens. It happens fairly regularly. And when I look at I'm like, well, this is part of the process. This is the unfortunate reality of a messy political process, which is what we have by design. And this is not to justify that behavior. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what does happen here is this is part of what we see when people get really upset and they use their voice option. I think in the course I talked about Albert Hirschman, his book Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, where he talks about what do you do when you feel like you don't have a democratic option. Well, you could leave, just get up and leave. You can protest, or you can use your voice option. These people using their voice option. Now, whether they're justified in that voice option is a separate question. Now, um, so this is so is our democracy in jeopardy? No, I don't think so. I think it's easy for people, especially politicians, to say, "Oh, this is going to damage our democracy." Blah 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 blah. Initial response is probably not. It really depends on how the people who don't believe the elections are fair, how durable is that belief, and will that belief change, and can they be convinced that the election will eventually become fair or can be fair? And that's a different question. But in terms of just this happening, it's tragic, right? Someone died, and it's not a good thing. But I don't think this is like the end, or the death knell of democracy in the United States or our system of government. I mean, I'm not that doom and gloom. I look at other countries around the world and how fractious and contentious and potentially and sometimes violent they are, and this is pretty on par for the course for a democracy. Um, you know, and so the other piece of this too is the reaction against this has been appropriate. What we've seen is that you know, there was this push, this protest, this riot, whatever you want to call it again, and the response was swift. People condemned it. All parties, from the Republicans to the Democrats to people in the administration, condemned it, and they said this is not right, this is not good. And but nevertheless, it's not. Again, I think there's hyperbole involved in this. People want to say, oh, this is democracy is over. The same way that the people are protesting are saying democracy is over because Joe Biden won, which is ridiculous, right? So the real question is again is can those people who accept this conspiracy theory that Trump's election was stolen, can they be made to try to trust the system again? And if there's a large segment of the population who cannot trust the system again, refuse to trust the system again, then that's a problem. Now, was this a protest, terrorism, a riot, or an insurrection? I really despise using such terminology in general. They were just watching, I think it was Fox News or something, and they had some talking head on. He's like, it's by the definition of, by the FBI definition, this means domestic terrorism. You give the definition. That same definition also means the definition of a protest. And the right uses the same type of language when they talk about when they talk about the protest in Ferguson, or protest in for the George Floyd protest. And it's not, I would argue it's not domestic terrorism. These are people who have a viewpoint, who have a political viewpoint, feel impassioned by that viewpoint, and they protested. And that protest got violent. Now, is it a riot? Maybe, possibly. That's possible. To use domestic terrorism is this term that's thrown around as pejorative. Oh, it's terrorism. And no, these people were not. The definition of terrorism in the broadest sense is use a political action, a violent action to instill fear, to use fear as a political tool. And this was people who legitimately believe in their viewpoint, and they wanted to make that viewpoint known, and they used violence to do so. Now, in the course, I've talked at great lengths about, in Lecture 4, the lecture on civil rights and civil liberties, about the fundamental paradox of protesting. That unless you're violent, unless you kind of make a big scene, you're not going to get your point across. You're just, oh, those guys are protesting again, so be it, whatever. And this accomplished that goal. And so there. Now, I never try to justify. Remember, in the course, I said, like, I'm not trying to justify that behavior. I'm not trying to say this is a good thing that you break windows, or you destroy buildings, or you break into the Capitol building. That's normatively wrong. It is a fundamental. It's breaking the law. I do not support that in the least. But from an analytical standpoint, in terms of protesting logic, if they just sat there and waved their flags and said Trump won, they were like, oh, that's cute, right? Those guys, they believe he won, right? But now they made this a much bigger deal, and this now becomes a much more prescient issue about trying to convince these people, or trying to prosecute these people, or trying to dissuade people from that viewpoint. And so that, I think they were somewhat successful in doing that and shifting the narrative. They weren't successful they're not going to be successful in dissuading the election, changing the election outcome. That's just not going to happen. But what they can do is show general fervor and anger about the direction that Joe Biden would be going, how fractious the country is right now. Those are things that were communicated, and I would argue will be put under consideration by lawmakers when they pass legislation. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, from an analytical standpoint, I see this as a pretty good analog to what we saw in Minneapolis, right? Or I wouldn't say an analog there, but to a police killing that's justified, right? So oftentimes there'll be a protest for a police shooting. The shooting itself is justifiable. It was deemed illegal, right? And so people protest because they're upset for a variety of different reasons, and some of those grievances are legitimate. I would make the argument this is very similar, that the fundamental crux of their complaint here, that this election was fraudulent, is baseless. There's not much justification for that viewpoint, and I'll talk about that in a minute, why there is that case. But it doesn't change the overall anger and sentiment and frustration that is the root of this. And that, in that respect, that is the same basic impetus, right? So the fundamental, again, in a justifiable police killing, the police officer is justified, right, by the law. By the law, Joe Biden won. It doesn't mean people are going to be happy about it. And so that's where we get to the root of it. That's why I think it's pretty analogous. Where these people have a right to protest. They have a right to have their viewpoint heard, and they don't have a right to break into the Capitol building, to create violence, do all these different things. That's not justifiable. But to make your point heard, that is a way to violence is a way to do that. We talked a lot about in the course. Well, violence has utility. It's not normatively good, right? It's not morally good. It's not something I'm saying people should engage in. There's much better ways of accomplishing your goals, right? But there is utility in it. We've seen this quite a bit as someone who has studied violence extensively in my own research. Now, just like Ferguson, sorry, I'm taking out my various electronic devices. Just like Ferguson and in Minneapolis, in Kenosha, and all these other places, we have to understand the context. And I think that's really important. I think so often it's lost is the context by which these protests happen. I'm adjusting my cord because what I do with my hands. I feel like it's what's that? Talladega Nights, where he doesn't know what he's doing with his hands. So I feel like that. This is the first time I've used video, and I'm trying to figure if this is worthwhile. So please let me know in the comments if this is worthwhile to see. Because as a quick tangent, the final question I'm trying to answer with using video is: do I get better engagement from my students in terms of talking to me if they see a human face? I've never shown my face in the course. And will this change things? Will people say, oh, he's a real person, he's not just a disembodied voice? I'm not going to do all my lectures, but I wonder if this helps engagement. If people say, oh, well, he's, an oddly looking person, but he looks like he's kind of nice. He could be possibly nice, right? So that's what I'm hoping people see here, right? I'm not just a voice, right? Which I've never done that. I tend to be more of a shy individual, so I don't like to put my face out there online as much. Nevertheless, plus I have this headset on, which makes me look like I'm doing customer support. I've tried using external mics; they don't work that well. But anyways, that's a complete tangent, which you're probably used to by being by being one of my students, one of my former students. So, but we have to understand the context here. I think that's really important to understand the context here. Just like in Minneapolis, right? We did the George Floyd protest. If we didn't understand the context, then we don't kind of understand the history involved. Like, remember, the first lecture of the course, which I'm re-recording right now, that's why I remember it. We talk about history and the importance of history to understand political events. And you need to understand the historical basis for why people are upset where we are right now. And the first fundamental thing is the pandemic. People are upset. The pandemic has been going on now almost a year. We're going close to a year now. People on lockdown, economic suffering, all these different things. And people are really frustrated. And the political right has had frustration with how these lockdowns, how these have been implemented. Many of those frustrations have legitimate roots in them. In terms of, does the government have the legal right to shut some of these down? Are some of these things fair? And and then there's also further frustration with stimulus money, all these other things going on. So there's this really large level of pent-up frustration on top of narratives of control, narratives, all these different things that are more baseless in general. And this is just the psychological turmoil this has had. And people are depressed, people are upset, and that level of frustration, anxiety, and anger, especially in these big spikes when you see Los Angeles rationing things and whatnot, creates a level of frustration and anger. And when there's already this level of frustration, to further prime the keg, or prime the pump, you're going to you have people talking about going back into more lockdowns. It makes people quite angry and anxious and frustrated. And when you have a narrative of election fraud and elections being stolen, that's going to make people further upset. And we'll talk about more about those narratives in a second. The other issue is economic turmoil, which goes along with the pandemic. There is quite a bit of economic turmoil right now. With stimulus money, with things getting cut, and then just a year of this pandemic, people have been hit economically pretty hard. And in the Las Vegas area, which we were all in, The casinos are still shut down. People, many of you are still out of work, and that people have lost their livelihoods and are going to lose their businesses and things like that. That's really frustrating. And for the political right, that is a point of contention about this. And what do we do about this? And especially since they're more business oriented. Now, that's not a bad thing. Um, so the other issue is it's a bitter election with both sides demonizing one another. The last 4 years have seen both sides, and I would argue that both sides have done equally this, demonizing other people. The right calling the opposing side socialist and communist or things like that, and enemies of the state. And then you have the left, after Trump was elected, saying that we should create a list of people who worked with them, and we should never let we should create a list and things like that. Those are contentious things, and those are things that are problematic immensely. And and people losing family members, people can be, all these different things, or and just saying they can't get along with people who don't agree with them politically, has created a very fractious political polity and political culture. And this election cycle, where people say Donald Trump's, we're just going to destroy America, baseless, right? Trump, didn't even come close to destroying America. Many of his policies were controversial and could have been and hurt certain individuals. But the same was could be said for Obama, in different ways. And so the idea that Joe Biden's going to come in, he's going to destroy America, he's going to destroy the economy, pretty much baseless, right? The president, as I said in the course, is relatively powerless. They can't really do much on their own. And Joe Biden will have a little bit better help because he's going to control, the Democrats will control Congress, but he still doesn't have the ability to do all these different things. If Joe Biden implemented a New Deal, the Green New Deal, will it be, socialism? Like people say, it's no. There'll be elements of socialism there, but as we said in the course, capitalism and socialism are ideal types. They're not things that what companies just say, oh, we're socialist, right? And everything they do is a socialist. Socialist theory is this theory that's where the government controls the economy, right? It's a government managed economy. Very few countries actually do that. What you see are elements of socialism involved. So whenever you say, oh well, there's that one thing that looks socialist, therefore we're socialist, right? That is a completely inaccurate statement, or it's such a broad statement and such an application that where it's like, well, conversely, there's elements of capitalism, so therefore are we just a capitalist country too? So it's an analytically baseless statement, and and often the other issues that people are conflating capitalism or socialism and communism, which are not the same, or even that did that in great depth in the course. So so you have both sides demonizing one another, and that's a problem, right? Where they view this as an existential struggle, and the idea that and then that mean the stakes for losing were so high that the idea that people thought, well, we can't lose. There's no way we could possibly lose. And the other issues with the pandemic is that Donald Trump was doing fairly well. And I would argue that if it wasn't for the pandemic, Trump probably would have won. He didn't lose. This was something one of my students during this last semester pointed out, because I made the claim that Trump didn't, he barely lost the election. And if you look at the electoral votes, it doesn't look like that. But my point, when this student correctly challenged me on this, and this is a point I should have been more articulate about, was, Trump, the margin at which Trump lost many states was not that great. The states that were in play, they weren't really that great. Look at Florida, look at Georgia, you look at Pennsylvania, they weren't massive losses. Nevada too, right? In Arizona, they weren't huge losses. And they were close enough that if one factor had changed in his favor, that he could have won. And I think that's really what it comes down to, for why I say it's close. And so the idea that they could lose this election was so antithetical to what they thought was going to be good for the country that that created an element of disbelief. On top of that, there is a And, we'll talk about this in a minute too, but the idea, the narrative of fraud was started many, many years ago, actually several years ago, and was maintained throughout this whole entire time. So Trump created this narrative and primed the pump, is basically for people to believe in fraud. Now, there's also this other factor of in terms of the historical context of both sides ideologically becoming more ideological extreme. And part of this is social media creating echo chambers. I have a, as many of you have heard me say, I despise social media, Facebook and various other ones that just create echo chambers where people say, oh, we all get along, we're all, and there's no one to really challenge your viewpoint. We also see this with the media, CNN and Fox News and Breitbart, and now Newsmax and all the other new ones coming out where these we're yay Trump or all negative for Trump, and this creates people just echo chambers where they can become ideologically much more extreme. And as you've experienced in the course, I despise people who are ideologues. I mean, I'm of the mindset that reasonable people can and should disagree, and so when we have so as we become more ideological, so people can say, well, that other's viewpoint, I might not agree with it, but it might be reasonable. And that's really what I want to get with people to understand that might actually be reasonable. That doesn't happen. And what you see, as we become more ideologically extreme, you see people unable to accept the other side. It turns out as their viewpoints being valid. And I mean, that's kind of the crux of the course that I created, was that we would understand one another and understand that both sides can disagree, and that's okay to disagree, right? It's okay to have differences of opinion, and we can respect that too. Um, and so, but that hasn't happened politically in at large. And the conservative media hasn't helped this. People like Rush Limbaugh and whatnot, where they, you know, where they talk about the right in demonizing language. I would argue that on the left, there's people like Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart who've done similar things where they've made the right to be buffoons. And that is not as extreme and not as problematic, I would say, but that whole infotainment idea is extremely problematic to me. Um, and both sides have also deviated from norms of behavior, and we can thank our own Harry Reid from Nevada and Mitch McConnell for doing so. They both deviated from behaviors in the Senate in terms of norms of behavior, norms of what was done with judicial nominees, and which has become the Senate become more fractious and much more of a zero-sum game. I would argue also that Trump and Obama have both violated the norms of what you do in office and have used the executive power of the presidency to such an extreme that has created a lot of problems. I was talking to someone close to me about this. I won't say my relation to them. A family member. I will say that much. And they pointed out how troubling Trump's ardent supporters were, and I said that's very true. It's very troubling, and I'm not disputing that. But I made the argument, as I made in the course, that Obama supporters I find equally troubling, if not more, are his ardent supporters. I call them cultists, right? People who think they can do no wrong. And it's because that many things that Trump did in terms of the use of executive power, Obama also did. But somehow he skated by with very little criticism. DACA is a fundamentally unconstitutional executive order. I'm not saying it's wrong. That's a different argument, right? But that's the power of the legislature. That's an abuse of executive power through and through. There's no doubt about it. And that's not to say that the program itself is not a wonderful program. I do think it is a wonderful program. Many of my students have been DACA recipients, and that's fantastic. But that's something Congress should have done. And Obama also did things like extrajudicial killings of American citizens with drone strikes. No one seems to want to talk about that, right? Oh, well, it's okay. Well, that guy who was an American citizen, but also probably could have been a terrorist, but wasn't actually attacking us. It's okay that we killed him without due process. That's fine. The whole Bill of Rights doesn't really matter because you're Obama, you're cool. I have a real problem with that, right? Now, my point of contention with this is that Trump, whenever he did, was countered constantly with the courts, with public opinion, all these different things. And Obama was like, yeah, cool, that's cool, man. Oh, you want to oust Muammar Gaddafi and not provide support after him? That's cool, right? And that you're going to create just chaos and anarchy there, and then create problems in sub-Saharan Africa that you don't want to deal with. A lot of criticism of that, right? And but that criticism is not really articulated anymore, right? Media high fives them and says, "Oh, well, you're cool, man," and I have a real problem with that. And but there's this push for the executive to have all this power, and Obama did the same thing, and he got frustrated with a Congress that wasn't doing what he wanted or wasn't passing his policies, and so he used executive power because that's all he had to do. Trump did the same thing, and so and he Obama set the stage. Then you have people Obama further. I'm going to criticize him pretty thoroughly because I have a lot of criticism of him, not because of his policies, how he uses his power, and where he talks about ending the filibuster. So he got frustrated because he couldn't get his policies passed, and now during this last election cycle, he says, "Well, maybe we should end the filibuster." So that what that does is that, and his justification was this was a Reconstruction era Paul rules set into Senate. So, right, it fundamentally gives the minority party power, and it allows them the ability to have their voice be heard. And we are not a country of the tyranny of the majority. And for him to float that idea during an election cycle, now the assumption by the right is that, oh, they're going to undo the filibuster and they're going to pack the court. And that makes the stakes very, very high. And I think those comments did such a disservice to creating unity in the country that I would, if I could meet a Barack Obama, I would say, "Hello, Mr. Ex-President, you're an idiot, and you've done great damage to our system of government because of your ideas, not because of your policies, because the way you enacted your ideas, and because you float those ideas that are antithetical to a Republican democracy that has the minority has at least some say." But who am I but an adjunct professor at CSN? Yeah, I got on my high horse there for a second, but you can see why this is from the right wing's perspective. This is very problematic, and this kind of seeded the whole problem of like the zero sum game. Now, the other issue here is social media, and social media has created an immense amount of disinformation. If you look at most of the conspiracy theories surrounding the election about the fraud, it's a video. It's some of it. There's one report about the Binion voting machine, and I read the report. The report really didn't say much, but it gave no justification for their viewpoint. And I started googling the people who wrote this report, couldn't find them. So I don't know where the report came from, but it's often cited. And there are things that were troubling. I'm not saying there wasn't, right? There are things that raise big questions, right? But there's no smoking gun here. And what has happened is that social media has allowed people to say, "Oh, here's a narrative. Here's a narrative about what happened, and let's fill in the pieces with these little tidbits that might be good or bad, right? And to fill that narrative to create a story." And the problem is that if you're looking at those individual tidbits, they don't really play out, and they don't really give much of an indication that there was widespread voter fraud. Was there voter fraud? Absolutely. There's no doubt about there was voter fraud. Fraud happens every election. Was there a voter fraud at a greater rate than other elections? Doesn't look that way, right? John Lott, who is a political economist, a controversial one, released a report from the Justice Department, which I had still to pick through, and about the election fraud, and saying, statistically speaking, there's some things that were abnormal. That's the best you're going to get. And there's these other arguments about statistical abnormalities. Those are basically baseless because statistics doesn't behave normally at all times. They say, "Oh, this is different than before." Well, this is a different year. This is an abnormal year. to say this is that, oh, this is impossible, that's rubbish, complete rubbish, mathematically speaking. So, anyways, but what social media has done is a lot of this decentralization of information, right? So now we can just pick and choose what we pick, and then you have people who say, well, we have our own echo chamber, and we're just going to create a narrative about what we want to believe. And this gets to my point about Donald Trump and creating this whole narrative from a long time ago. He started talking about fraud from a long time ago, and say, oh, there's going to be fraud, there's going to be fraud, there's going to be fraud, right? They can't win otherwise. Well, if you keep on saying that, you're going to get people to believe that. So he starts creating this narrative. And then when he loses, he's like, oh, well, it was obviously fraud here, right? And, so he's basically primed people to believe this story. Now, Donald Trump has a long history of claiming fraud. He didn't get nominated for an Emmy. Oh, it's fraudulent, right? He loses. I mean, there's countless instances in his business life where he claimed fraud. And he's, I can't possibly lose. And if you get into the psychology of Donald Trump, it gets really into this idea that he's incapable of accepting losses. Whenever he loses something, he recouches it as a win. And I think that's a certain, I'm not a psychologist, but this looks to be a neurosis at some level. Now, the one point I didn't make, which I got ahead of myself, was about gerrymandering too. I've talked about this in the course as well. Gerrymandering being a fundamental problem, and this further creates ideological extremes. Right? We have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? I'm not. This is not to disagree with her policies, but she's one of the most liberal members of Congress, or progressive, whatever you want to call it, and she describes herself as a socialist, right? She's not moderate, and the fact that she's able to get elected tells you very much that she's becoming more the gerrymanders allow that district to be so safe that you can elect people who don't really have to cater to the middle. And this happens on the left and the right. I can't give you one example on the right because I don't really care that much to look at those example of that. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is all over the media. She's and I think there's a certain level of sexism involved in that, but that's neither here nor there. About why she's a media darling. Now Trump has created a cult of personality, the same way Obama has done it. But Trump has done it to a degree I think is a little more aggressive than Obama. And I know in the course I've talked about my disdain for cults of personality. And the idea for Trump is that this cult of personality is that he's some type of messianic figure, and people really do believe that. And this has created a base that's extremely loyal to him. Prior to the election, when polled, I think it was something like 91% of Republicans said they thought he was doing a good job. Now, those are people who are Republicans, and so that's not writ large, right? And Donald Trump didn't lose by, I think he lost by 8 or 9 points popularly, right? So that's pretty indicative that people who are diehard Trump supporters are going to be really diehard, right? Think, he did a fantastic job, and whether he did a good job or not, that's something I can't say right now because I don't really have a basis knowledge to do so. I need time and distance from these events to understand what really happened. I have criticisms, right? I have many criticisms you've heard in the course, but this cult of personality then says, oh well, we're loyal to the president, right? That's who we're loyal to, and this has helped further that narrative of of us versus them, right? There's the swamp, and they're just gonna do whatever they want, right? The problem with that is, for this to be true, you'd have to have Mike Pence. The entire court system, which has ruled against him, has not ruled in his favor one time. People who he appointed, by the way, say, oh well, your claims are baseless. So the people he appointed, and the people the people who his own vice president, and the people who worked with him in Congress, and his own party, all went against him in their as my dog wakes up. This is what you see if you saw the video. They all went against him. Pause this real quick. Sorry. So typically, when I do this without the camera on me, you just kind of see me. I just pause and go take care of this, but and I go take care of that. So, anyways, that was my daughter, my youngest daughter, Maisie. Say hi. Um, but anyways, so what Trump has created is, this ideologically strong base, right? Where people, they view him as, you know, as the bringer of truth, right? That's why you saw like QAnon, you saw various other instances of people viewing Trump as this outsider. And he's painted himself as an outsider, and he could have done really cool things with that. And that's something that's actually not a bad place to be as a politician, as a true outsider, as he really was. The problem, like as I said before, is that you need all these different people who, many of them have a vested interest in him winning, to go to they all went against him, right? So is it that they're all against him, or is that he's just wrong? The simple solution, Occam's razor, right? Occam's razor is presented with two equally possible outcomes. The simplest outcome is probably the true outcome. Is that, this is William O. Occam, is that he's just wrong. So the idea that all of these people, many of whom he appointed, right, don't back him, it's pretty clear to me that he just didn't win, and his viewpoints are just, his whole approach to this is flawed. And Lynn Wood and Sidney Powell are hucksters, in the best way, the nicest way I can put it, right? Not much there in terms of actual substance in terms of the lawsuit. Lynn Wood is, well, I won't comment on Lynn Wood. Now, again, Trump's, so you have this, this brand, this cult of personality that he can't lose, and he's created this bias, and and this created a bias in people who thought, one, he couldn't win, he couldn't possibly lose. He's this extraordinary figure. On top of that, then you have this narrative of fraud, and this created a group of people who are diehard, adamant that this, and then on top of the other narrative of, the left being the enemy, right, as fundamentally diametrically opposed to American values, and most of those are all, at best exaggerations, if not flat out wrong. Um, you know, and so I'm not gonna get, there's really no justification for calling the left, right, anti-American, right? What it comes down to, many of these are just different values, which, which are fundamental, which are going to be part of a democracy, a Republican democracy. So, yeah, it's a ridiculous argument. Anyways, so those variables cause people to be fervently believe that this is really, something that's so important that they need to go protest this. They need, so important, they need to make their voice be heard and be violent about it, because they truly believe that the country is being stolen. Now, this is all premised on a false premise, right? And so, I admire their moxie at some level, not their violence, and not their adherence to basic logic about what actually happened. And so this has caused, this event today. That's all to say what causes, at least in my opinion, right? I've only had half a day to think about this. I might come to a different conclusion a few months from now, right? The other, the other thing that happened yesterday was this directly caused the loss of the Senate to the Republicans. If I were a Republican, I would be furious, right? Donald Trump lost the Senate for the Republicans. Not only did he lose the election, he lost the Senate for them because of his continual bashing of Republicans in Georgia and reducing confidence in the election. And so there's no way to shape or way to really couch this. He lost it for them. And if by that in of itself, Republicans should say, you're an idiot. And so you cost us a lot. And so he gave, not only did he lose to Biden, he gave Biden a Senate that is now more in his favor. We'll talk about it in a second, right? So there's a lot of criticism. If I were a Republican, I would put it at his feet. If I was a Democrat, I would be high-fiving right now because he's done a wonderful service to you, because he's allowed Biden a better path to get some things done, like what you might like. And so, good job, Trump. Bad job, Trump. I don't know. Anyways, so um, you know, the Republicans should be rightfully upset at him, and they're upset at him um, right now. You know, when it was just to losing the Senate, it was harder for them to be that upset because Trump is still very popular amongst the Republican base. Now, what happened today, I would argue that there's not many Republicans, established Republicans in politics, that are going to support Trump. He's become more toxic. We'll talk about that in a minute. Um, and so Republicans should rightfully be upset at Trump. I think a lot of the anger is still vested at the people, the Republican Secretary of State, Mike Pence, all people who are following the law. And what Trump asked in that call the other day, released, was asking the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia to violate the law, and was fundamentally illegal. Um, and that's pretty damning. So will that anger shift from those other people to Trump eventually? I would hope so. Where the Republican would self-reflect and realize, oh, yeah, that guy was probably hurt us pretty bad. I would hope so. But at this point, I would I don't put it past them to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, or yeah, snatch yeah, whatever the saying is, like where basically they can screw themselves over. Now, what does this mean for Biden? I would argue, and whether he does this or not, he has to be much more moderate. That anger, that violence, is effective at some level. What we saw today, and it says, hey, people are upset, and people don't like where the country's necessarily going to go, and they're willing to go to that great length. In the same way that the anger after Kenosha or after George Floyd or Minneapolis, or they'll say, oh, we should defund the police, right? Or we should take all the money away from the police. Not that reasonable of a policy, or just take all the police, just redo the police force, right? Not necessarily a bad idea. I mean, in terms of just restructuring things to some degree, but not very realistic, right? In the same respect, but people have to take that into consideration. Say, okay, well, people are upset about how the police are structured. Maybe we should rethink some parts of this. I would argue that Biden probably should normatively do the same thing, right? It's a normative statement, right? Where he should say, well, people are upset. I can't go too far to the left, right? I have to be much more moderate, and not to make sure these people see that I'm not just what they think I'm going to be, right? So if he goes down a progressive road, a really progressive road, he's not going to bring people back in the fold. Now, Joe Biden also has to appease his own base as well, so he can't just ignore that. He can't just be a Republican, right? He also needs to prove the elections are fair. And I'm not sure if he can. I'm not sure the people who believe they're not fair will ever see them as fair. But I would argue that he should form a commission, and he should investigate this and prove to people, as best as he can, the election process is fundamentally sound. I don't think he will do this. I think that would be too costly, it'd be too difficult for him, and you don't think he really sees the necessity, nor do I think it would wholly be effective. But I think that's something he should do. Now, the Democrats have the thinnest majority possible in the Senate, which means they can't go too aggressive. They can get much more passed. Biden will have an easier time getting appointees done. There's a lot of things he'll be able to do that are going to be much more beneficial to him. But they can't go nuts, right? They can't just implement whatever they want, because that would mean that there's going to be pushback, and they're going to lose the Senate in 2 years. They're probably going to lose it in 2 years anyways. They're probably going to lose the House as well. Americans like divided government, and as I said in the course, there's a fundamental. It's very easy for people to when the party in power say, "Oh, you guys suck," and we're gonna vote for the person now. It's an easy narrative to have. It's an easy ploy. So I think that very much matters. And so I think they're going to lose the Senate probably in 2 years, and might lose the House in 2 years. if 2020 is an indication, you've lost ground in the House, and the Senate really was only lost because of Donald Trump. So I would argue that's probably going to happen. Um, and so, but if they want to keep the Senate and keep the House, they're going to have to be a little more moderate. Now, will the 25th Amendment be invoked? Maybe, probably not. I would say. 25th Amendment would be to remove the president because he's incompetent or incapacitated. I think that's going to be a bridge too far. I think what will end up happening is his advisors and his people they're just going to stop listening to him. We got 2 weeks left. They're like, yeah, that's nice, and just stop listening to him. I think that's probably going to be the case. They say I want to do this, and be like, yeah, whatever. I'm going to slow walk it or not do it at all. Will Donald Trump be impeached? Maybe. This pointless. I mean, articles will probably be filed. He won't actually be impeached because it just takes too long to do. There's just not enough time. I think Ilhan Omar is doing it, and one of the authorities have already prepped articles of impeachment. They'll file them. It's not going to go anywhere because he's going to be gone in 2 weeks. Now, will Trump come back in 2024? A week ago, 2 weeks ago, I'd say maybe, and I would say it's pretty low priority now. I think he's burned his brand, and I think Trumpism has now died. At least I hope it's died. We'll see how much criticism is really leveled against him, but even amongst his base, despite his base is not going to leave the Republican Party. The party's going to, he's going to be out of office, and then a couple of years from now, they're going to forget him. He's going to be, he's going to be forgotten about to some degree. But but because of what he's done now, any of the person who has political power is going to be like, yeah, we're not going to back you. He's lost his support amongst people in politics, and I don't foresee him gaining that support again. So I think he's done politically. He might try a new news network or whatnot, but other than his diehard base, he's really can't foresee anyone backing him, and so he's really kind of screwed himself over. So that's 47 minutes of me talking about this. That was way longer than I thought it would be. I hope this was helpful, and please let me know if the video helps at all. I don't know. I've done enough Zoom and Meets meeting now to look at my own facial expressions, realize how odd and awkward they are. So if this was helpful, or you thought this was better engagement, or you thought this was completely pointless, let me know because it really does help me. I don't like to do this. I like to keep my image off the internet in general, but I'm trying really hard to have more engagement. I'm really worried about people just dropping on my course and not feel like there's a person behind the voice. And this is a test to see if this one change can actually cause people to really, seek my help more readily, because I really don't like people just disappearing. Thank you for listening. That's my little 2 cents on the what happened last 2 days. So thank you, and please comment. I know I've been really bad about my YouTube channel and commenting. I'm going to endeavor to do better. A lot of this was workflow issues, me figuring out how to deal with those workflow issues. I think I have it figured out. Honestly, it's just learning the technology. Like, I seriously didn't realize that it'll notify me if a message on my Gmail. Just didn't even notice that. Probably because I'm really busy. So let me know if this was worthwhile. If you appreciated it, I do want your. For all my former students, I do appreciate your feedback. I do value all of you as people, and I do want to hear from you all. Because I love hearing from you guys. It really does make me feel. You just make me. You enjoy that because I get like, oh, well, I want them to do well. I want them to be. I want to be engaged. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.